My baby dolls, we're back again. Another episode of Genesis. We have a recurring guest, and he was on the show last month. We spoke a little bit about Marvin Miller. We have Krister Swanson, who wrote the book Baseball's Power Shift, How the Players Union, the Fans, and the Media Changed American Sports Culture. You are listening to the great Genesis show, as people like to say it. I don't know. I'm not that keen on me being a great newscaster or interviewer. I'm like a song and dance man. But Ralph Tycho, the Zigzag Man, he runs the network and the Comfortably Zoned radio network, and we are honored to be on his network. We got the man with the plan. We got the co-captain, the co-pilot today. We got Marc Weiss.
Hey, good morning. Actually, I should say good afternoon, everyone. Looking forward to the show. Hopefully I don't drive this train into a ditch or anything, but let's keep it going.
It couldn't have been any worse than Bowie Coon. Anyhow, he drove it into a ditch.
Nothing
But anyway,
Bowie Coon.
we got Krister Swanson, and just to refresh your memory on Krister Swanson, he has a PhD in modern American history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is a teacher at Thousand Oaks High School in California, and is a content developer and presenter at the ABC Clio Publishing. And of course, he has nice weather. We also have former Major League Baseball player Jimmy Driscoll, and that is a treat in itself, because Jimmy was drafted by the Milwaukee Braves in 1962. A's picked him up. Team moved to Oakland. He was there with all the swinging A's, and he just came back a few months ago from the 50th anniversary. He had plenty of pictures to show us, seeing all those great guys again. And he, during 72, he was with the Texas Rangers. And for a few years after that, he was, in 75, I believe he was with the Cincinnati Reds, and he retired, in 75. So he saw this whole Marvin Miller stuff and stuff go down. And welcome to the show, gentlemen. We'll start with Jimmy. Jimmy, let me ask you something. Since when Marvin Miller came onto the scene in and around 1966, what was the vibe amongst the players of unionizing?
Well, I'll tell you, my first recollection of Marvin was in spring training. And what he would do, he would go to visit each ball club. And we would, in the meeting room was actually on the field. We were all sitting in center field on the grass with Marvin, giving his little recitation. And at that time, we were all under the reserve clause. I mean, you had to be with the club you were with, and if you didn't want to be with them, you went home. It was simple as that. You were going home or you were getting released. But anyway, Marvin, God bless Marvin, and his sidekick there, Moss. I forget his first name. His last name was Moss, but
Dick Moss.
Come to me in a minute. Yeah, he was there, and they presented the fact that we should be unionized, because without the players, there's no such thing as ownership, and we were slaves. And as it boiled down to it, when Curt Flood went, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here now. When that was the case that Curt Flood went before the Supreme Court, and we were deemed actually we were slaves to the owners, and one thing led to another. But I remember Marvin's right in center field. I think he had some kind of a little bit of a handicap in one of his arms. I'm recollecting, and holding his clipboard and giving us the insight on the benefits of unionizing, and I'll never forget it. And I'll start off with that, and then you'll continue, Ian.
Time went by, and they finally voted for the Players Association and unionizing. You got into the league at 62, and of course we spoke with Krister last time. Around 68, the whole pension thing was going on. We'll talk about that, and then your observations of that in 68, 69.
Well, the pension, the minimum salaries were so ridiculous. I mean, it was the sign of the times, of course, but the minimum salaries, once the players unionized, the collective bargaining took over, and there's power in groups. There's power in groups. You see it all around the country now in unions. But when you're going in as a union, you have power behind you. And the salary started going up. The minimum was raised, and it was things were looking bright for the players. And as time went on, just rushing forward to today, I think the minimum salary in the majors today is $400,000 a year. 400 big ones. And that's the least you can make. That's the least you can make. So times have changed, and the players are reaping the rewards. Nobody's worth the kind of money that they're paying them now, but it turns out to be the going rate. That's why they're getting that big money. The television,
the free market, baby, the free market.
The free market, and television has paid billions of dollars to Major League Baseball. That's where they're getting all their money. Not from ticket sales or hot dogs. It's the TV money. And God bless them. It's a short-lived career, believe me.
If the owners are raking in the dough, they should share some of the dough. That's the way it should be.
Yeah. What would be fascinating to look at is player salaries as a percentage of revenue compared to back in 72. Because I think a big piece of what was happening in 72, there was the ongoing, as you say, Jimmy, there was the ongoing deal with the pension, but also the minimum salary, and players were really starting to make gains on minimum salary, and the owners were freaking out. At the time, it was about 40%. Player salaries and pension benefits were about 40% of operating costs. So it would be interesting to look at payroll now as a percentage of operating costs and those kinds of things. The percentage has got to be higher, but in regards to revenue, and especially with these ridiculous TV deals, well, I shouldn't call them ridiculous. It's a free market thing, Mark, like you're saying. It's a beautiful thing if you love the free market, but you look at what the Dodgers are pulling in, even with 50% of the households in their market not getting Dodger games on television.
Exactly.
And the Dodgers are still cranking in a crazy amount of money each year on just their local broadcast rights.
Did you see what happened with Yes with the Yankees? What they did, they sold the rights to Yes for 50 years to Fox to actually broadcast the games, and they own the rights and sell the commercials. And I think they got like $40 billion just from them to have the rights to keep Yes for 40 or 50 years, and then it reverts back to the Steinbrenner family after that. It's amazing. What a great deal.
So almost $1 billion a year.
Yeah, almost $1 billion a year for the rights to telecast the Yankee games, but they still own the network and in perpetuity, and then they get it back in 40 years and they can sell it to someone else.
But it's about where the networks are, right? In their search for live programming where people will watch through the commercials.
Now let me ask you something.
And I'm sorry, I took us off the rails from what Jimmy
was doing. That's all right.
Don't worry, that's my job here.
That's all right. Jimmy,
it's all the same subject. We can jump around. I mean, if we get ahead of each other, we can revert back, so don't worry about it.
Right.
Because
I was particularly interested in Jimmy's thoughts on what was happening with minimum salaries in the time, through the late 60s and into the early 70s, because my recollection is that 72 was about the pension, but it was also about increasing minimum salaries, and it was about the owners trying to really say, well, screw this. The players have gotten enough. We're going to draw a line in the sand right here, and that's kind of what precipitated the strike. But I would love Jimmy's thoughts on that, his recollections of what kind of got to this point where the players were actually willing to walk out.
Yeah, in 72, I'm in spring training with, that was Texas. I was with Texas then, and that was the year of the strike. What year was the strike? Was it 72 or 73? I think 72.
72 was the strike. 73 was the lockout.
That's right. And we were in spring training, and Big Frank Howard, he was our team rep. Big Hondo.
The capital punisher.
Oh, my God. Swing hard in case you hit it. He had the meeting. He had the meeting with the players. It was just the players only. And Frank Howard, I'll never forget this. He said, listen, guys, once they give you the pink slip, which is your release, that's it. You could have been the greatest player in the world. Once you get the pink slip, it's nice knowing you, pal. So he was saying basically we have to band together, get what we can when we can, because when it's over, it's over. So I'll never forget.
Right.
You know, what he's done for me, it was their credo, you know.
I got a question. Didn't the owners try to make the players feel like ingrates for even trying to ask for more and to unionize? I remember hearing stories like if a Yankee wanted more than $100,000, they would turn around and say to them, Joe D only made $100,000. You're worth more than Joe D. Did they use bully tactics like that before the union really got strong?
Of course they did, and they were grasping at straws as it came down to the end. They would give you old news, but the old news eventually wasn't working because the players it was a brand new breed. I mean, the owners were used to sitting up in their skyboxes with a big cigar work and saying, you know, this is great. But meanwhile, when the players started gaining power, the owners, they were grasping at anything they could to try and, put a stymie on the movement forward by these players. So, yes, they were, but it didn't work. Although there were some of those guys back then that would bought into it, and they wound up signing for less money than they should have. But that was the early days of the union, so it wasn't as strong as it is today. It worked up to be, you know.
Jimmy,
yeah,
I was going to ask just one little quick question. Did you find that some of the star players were a little more hesitant to be part of the union? Did you think that held back the union from really, gaining its power quicker and actually getting you guys what you truly deserved?
Now that you mention that, Mark, now that you mention it, I'm recollecting back that yes, indeed, the established guys, and there weren't many there was a few on each team, but they were a little bit reluctant. They were sitting pretty as to use better terms. They were sitting pretty, so they were a little bit hesitant to throw all their cards on the table for the union. You're right.
Yeah,
Driscoll, let me ask you.
Go ahead, Ian.
Driscoll, let me ask you something, and then I got Jimmy's take on this. From the Kurt Flood case up until '72, what was going on in Marvin Miller's head at the time?
Well, I think that so the basic timeline goes, Marvin doing what Jimmy said, in '66, touring the camps and getting the players to buy in and agreeing to his leadership. Then it becomes about independent funding for the MLBPA, securing the pension and health care, and then starting to work on minimum salary. And all of those things were the things that were moving forward in that period of '66 leading into 69, 70. Flood obviously is 70, and then we don't get the Supreme Court decision until '72. But Flood was sort of a first shot in the war on the reserve clause, and the players really getting what they wanted when the owners agreed to go to collective bargaining on the reserve clause, because Miller knew he could pound the owners in collective bargaining. He knew that he could play on the disunity between the owners and all those big egos, as Jimmy put it, all the cigars in the skyboxes, all thinking that they could do better than the players, and Miller knew that's where he'd get them. By '72, it's really so free agency is simmering on the back burner, so to speak. The players are continuing to try and make gains in minimum salaries because let's remember, and Ian, we talked about this last time. Most guys, and Jimmy, I'm sure you could share stories with us on this. Most guys were working a winter job, in a factory or the post office or wherever to make ends meet, not training all winter like guys are able to now with the resources they have, but working a winter job just to make ends meet because their baseball salary was more or less in line with what maybe a well-paid factory worker would be making at that time. The guys making the minimum, $6,000 to $8,000 a year in the '60s was not as much as people would like to think, obviously. So when the players started making gains on minimum salary, that was kind of a big part of the push for them. It was minimum salaries. It was continuing to secure the pension, making sure that they had a fair share of the TV revenue, because the owners were finally waking up to realizing what a huge boon the TV revenue could be. Those were all really, really big kind of things. And so that's what's in that lead up. And it's interesting, Jimmy was mentioning the more established guys. that was something the owners had always played on through the history of unionization, because you've got an 80-year run-up prior to 1966 of the players trying to form unions in one way or the others, and the owners could almost always count on the highest paid guys to toe the company line and speak out publicly. And, of course, because the fans loved the Stars, you know, if the Stars said, well, the owners are treating us well, the owners are treating us right, the public wanted to buy that and not worry about the business aspects of the game as much. So that's certainly a huge part of the story for sure.
Definitely, and you're absolutely right about back in those days when I first signed, you had to have an off-season job. You'd go right from the seat. You were playing ball. First of all, we were playing ball. We were getting paid, not a whole lot of money, but the simple fact remains that we were given the God-given ability to put a bat on a ball, and it's called hand-eye coordination. And you're born with it. You can't work hard to get it. Either you have it or you don't. And because the cream rises to the top, and any little kid's dream is always to be in their backyard, calling 7th game of the World Series, Driscoll's at bat, Koufax on the mound, 3-2. You're going through it in your mind. But the older you get, you know, they separate the wheat from the tares, for the simple reason that it's a God-given ability. It's a hand-eye coordination that we were blessed with. So we were doing that. We were getting paid to play ball. We were grown men playing a kid's game. Once we realized that we weren't making that much money, we had to get an off-season job. You're right. I mean, I sold men's clothing, you know. You guy wanted a blue suit, you'd yell to your friend, put the blue light on. The guy wants a blue suit,
you know, Jimmy, I think you're being very humble and you're selling yourself and your cohorts short, because you did obviously God-given ability without a doubt, but you guys were entertainers. And to be quite frank, as a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s, late 60s, 70s and 80s, you were our cardboard gods. I mean, like when we got those baseball cards and we looked through them and saw the pictures and everything, we idolized you guys. I mean, you guys were our entertainment, and you made a lot of money for those owners. And I think that they found a way to use the media to kind of bully you guys into staying away from the union for a long period of time, until I guess Mr. Miller came along and he broke that wall down. At least that's my opinion anyway.
Well, that's about as clear as insight as I could give myself, because as I said, for the lack of a better word, we were slaves to the owners. We were slaves, and we enjoyed playing, but then we started realizing, due to Marvin Miller, that what we had, we were entertainers. We were blessed with the ability to do it. It's like back in that Prohibition, when all those nightclubs in, say, New York, and they'd all have the black entertainers on stage. But as the story goes, the blacks had all the rhythm, but the Jews owned the instruments, you know? So it was the same thing. It was the same thing. The players had the ability, but the owners held the purse string, you know? And you
certainly played for the owner who pulled those purse strings very tight, Mr. Finley.
Oh my God, Finley! He pulled them so tight his rug got askew one day.
Yeah, well, and Finley, of course, is a great guy for us to talk about, because he was, inadvertently sort of helped the players' cause, right, with both Vita Blue and Catfish Hunter.
Exactly.
Failing to meet the terms of Hunter's contract and allowing him to become the first de facto free agent. And then, with Vita Blue just being so parsimonious and tight in the way that he handled Vita's negotiations, that it really kind of opened things up and allowed people to start imagining how things might be down the road.
Exactly. Matter of fact, I roomed with Vita Blue when I was up with the Oakland A's, and a wonderful guy, and from Monroe, Louisiana. But
he could throw.
He was, talk about a start. He was Rookie of the Year, and I think it was MVP. His first
71
majors. Yeah. But yeah, the owners, as I said, they were smoking the big cigars. because they had everybody by the you-know-whats until Marvin Miller came aboard. And, God love him for what he did,
I wish the modern players would push and say, you know what, this guy's got to be in the Hall of Fame because of what he did. I mean, they have a part of the Hall of Fame for people who are contributors to baseball. And they keep putting owners in there. And to be quite honest, I don't see what many of these guys ever did for the game, to be quite frank, to put him in there. And here's a guy who revolutionized the game and made it as big as it is today. And quite frankly, made the players be able to make a living wage and then took them to the point where they're getting paid like entertainers, which they are. And he's not in. And it kills me.
I'll tell you what irks me that Marvin's not in, but a guy like Bud Selig who turned his head the other way.
Thank you.
Was going on. We all know the story. And Bud
Thank you.
Selig's in the Hall of Fame. And Marvin Miller.
Speak the gospel. Tell everyone about it.
There's something wrong with the scenario.
How is that man in the Hall of Fame? He sat by idly while PEDs were running rampant in the game because the owners were making a ton of money, and then he quote-unquote cleans it up, and now he's a hero?
Come on, guys. He saved, don't you know the legend goes, he saved baseball after the 95 strike.
Oh, please, he was a used car salesman who made himself commissioner.
I hope you know that was tongue-in-cheek. That's what Selig gets credit for, though, right?
Because he's writing the news.
I hope
right. He was,
Yeah. I hope this show is reaching the world because the truth's being said today. Finally. Yeah,
well, it's interesting. To jump forward and just make a quick observation here, the joy of having my own boys. So my oldest son especially is our biggest baseball fan, and he grew up in a time where it was normal to go to the stadium and expect your favorite player to hit a home run. Like that was going to happen. And I'll never forget, my uncle's a huge Cardinal fan, and so we had our share of Mark McGwire shirts, and we'd go see the Dodgers and the Cardinals, and he'd predict on the way to the game, Mark McGwire's going to hit a home run, and sure enough, it would happen. And it just, his version of baseball, right, from the time he was about 4 till he was about 9 was the peak of that era. There's guys launching it left and right, and so he's 20 now. He gets it. He understands what he was watching, but it's crazy how if you go back and you think about the 95 strike and how that kind of really blew things up and got a lot of people saying, well, I'll never go back to a baseball stadium again. What Selig gets credit for is sitting by and letting the McGwire, Sosa, Bonds thing play out and get people back into stadiums. And what he also totally benefited from, right, was teams got smart enough to build stadiums that people wanted to go see baseball games in, starting with Camden Yards and then, of course, Coors Field in Colorado. It became really cool to go to a baseball game again because of these awesome new buildings. And why Bud Selig gets credit for that, I'll never know. That was a lot of,
How about giving him credit for the World Series getting canceled in 1994? That never happened under anyone else's watch.
Right. Sure. Right. No, and they couldn't, and it was all just, again, because the owners were, in a place where they just weren't gonna give up, right? They weren't gonna, they were gonna dig in and they were gonna demand that, salary cap and everything else, we're gonna draw the line and we're gonna implode this thing. And, any worker who's looking at the situation the players were in, who would say it was stupid for the players to push and toe the line, isn't reading the situation right. I think any of us would have done the same thing, put ourselves in the players' shoes. And at that point, too, we got to remember the players had done nothing but win in terms of labor relations because they were right, and the money was there. The players would say the money's there, and eventually the owners would prove the money was there, and so by 95, I think we all should have seen that, that the players were going to be proven right once again, and they were.
Yeah.
I look at Selig, and the other thing you could throw in, look at Montreal, a great franchise, great fans. They never returned back to the game after the strike was over, and they lost their franchise.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it was from a fan. I didn't realize that watching these guys hit balls that are still going, some of them, McGwire, Sosa, Bonds. I mean, every swing of the bat they took, was a rocket somewhere, and it was fun to watch. Let's face it. Balls being hit that far and that often. It was fun to watch, not realizing that they had performance enhancing drugs to aid them. Yes, they had to have the ability to put the bat on the ball. The performance enhancing drugs were a combination of steroids and human growth hormone. One was working on the big muscles and the other one was working on the twitch muscles. So that combination made you stronger and quicker. Combine that with your natural ability, and 70 home runs later, you have Barry Bonds, you know.
And also the recovery factor, too, because when you're taking those things, you recover quicker. So a 37-year-old Barry Bonds is performing like a 27-year-old Barry Bonds who's pumped up much bigger than the 27-year-old Barry Bonds was.
He had a size 9 hat.
You're saying that's not normal?
That's a bowling ball.
Now, guys, let's go back.
I should say ebonite on it.
You know,
now let's go back to. Go ahead, Jimmy.
The alarm should have started going off, and maybe they did in some people's minds when Brady Anderson, he went from 7 home runs the year before to 52 the next year. Somebody should have been scratching their head, but they were saying he's worked out during the off season, and you know he's getting stronger. And he went from 8 to 50, I think, in one season. So
it's true.
It all traces back to that kind of time, you know.
I remember Chris Berman said that the only thing Brady Anderson ever led the league in was sideburns before that season.
He was right. Anyway.
Oh, that's funny. But anyway, let's get back to 72. Chris, what was going on before the spring training and between the owners and the players? And for the first time ever, the players were going to go on strike, weren't they?
Right. Well, it became clear that as the new collective bargaining agreement was coming up, that the owners were going to not give up anything on continued growth in minimum player salary or average player salary, and they were continuing to try to disassociate the TV revenue from the pension and those kinds of things. And so I think the owners felt like, you know, this was their chance. They had to stick together. They had to show the players they were serious. And by that point, right, you know, Marvin Miller had enough success that he had the player's ear, and I think, and I apologize, Ian, because I told this story last time we talked, I think, but
that's all right. Yeah.
Would love Jimmy's thoughts on this, but that Sparky Anderson was a family friend of ours, and I had a great talk with Sparky about this, and it's not in the book because I didn't want to source Sparky and stuff like that. But Sparky was still living when I was writing most of it, and what Sparky basically said to me, of course, by 72, you know, he was in place with the big red machine. But he said, once Marvin said, now's the time, we're going to strike, and it worked, he said from then on out, Marvin never had a problem with player militancy, never had a problem with player solidarity, that every single player, no matter how well paid they were all in. They were firm believers in what Marvin said and what the MLBPA could accomplish. And so I would love Jimmy's reflections on that, because that was Sparky's impression. Sparky's impression was that with that win in the 72 strike, that really locked it down for Marvin Miller.
Oh, absolutely. As I said, I mentioned a minute ago, I was in spring training with the Texas Rangers. And just to give you a little side note, the manager of Texas that year, of course, was the great Ted Williams. And just to give you a little side note here, my father, growing up, he was an usher at Fenway Park in Boston. I'm from the Boston area. And in 1948, I had my picture taken with Ted Williams at Fenway. I had a Red Sox uniform on, and his arm was around. It was a color picture in 48, so one of the first color shots. Anyway, 25 years later, I get traded from the Oakland A's to the Washington Senators. And that winter, the Senators left Washington to become the Texas Rangers. So I'm in spring training. Getting back to that spring training, that's the meeting that Hondo had with the players, Big Frank. He said, listen, we're going on strike. We're all in this together, and we're gonna do it. And we did it. And I made the ball club, and meanwhile, the strike hit the day before the season started or the last day of spring training. I'm in that time slot. And we were out. I forget how long we were out, but everybody went home. Everybody went home, bonding together. And there was a few little guys. There was one or two guys that showed up somewhere that the owners were trying to make a big deal out of because they weren't joining the rest of the troops. But that was a bonding of the players as a collective bargaining unit. And my father sent that picture down to me in spring training when I was 4 years old, and I waltzed it into Ted. And I said, Ted, will you sign this? He said, who is that? I said, that's me. He got the biggest kick out of it. He signed the picture and brought out another photographer, he and I together, and ran them back to back in the paper with the headline, Driscoll Williams reunited after 25 years.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it took 25 years to develop, but it's a story nonetheless, you know.
Did he really have that big booming voice like when we heard him on TV?
Oh, yeah. And plus he hated pitchers in Jen.
He said they were stupid, right?
He hated his own pitchers, even on his own pitching staff, you know.
Didn't he say pitchers are stupid?
He said, and he was all about offense. We were in spring training. It's usually a couple of 3 days dedicated to rundown plays or relay throws and bunting and covering bases. And we were in there. Somebody messed up 2 or 3 plays in a row during the rundowns, and Ted said, "F it," he said, "let's hit." And that was it. That was it. And he used to take batting practice with us. He'd jump in the cage with that jacket. I never took the jacket off, but he'd take his 10 swings, and meanwhile, he was probably 65 years old. I forget his age at the time, but he was still putting the bat on the ball, hitting line drives like they were going out of style, and he'd take his swings with the rest of us, and big smile on his face, you know.
I tell you, the best story I ever heard about him was in your era. Someone walked over to him. It might have been like even in that time frame, and someone said, "The way you're hitting the ball, Ted, you could probably still hit 300 in the major leagues." And he said, "No, I couldn't." And they go, "Why? The pitchers are better." He goes, "No, my legs are shot. I can't make it to first."
He was great, though. I mean, let's face it, he was the greatest.
He's the only manager to have a winning season for the expansion Washington Senators.
That's right. And then they had, I think Epstein was there. That Brinkman was there in those days. Aurelio Rodriguez, Big Hondo was there. Yeah.
Yep. Dick Bosman.
Dick Bosman. Yeah. So.
One day we got to get you back on the show just to talk about the Senators and the Rangers and Bob Short and how they left D.C. because I think that would be an interesting topic for people who follow our show.
Yeah, I remember opening night in Texas. They introduced each and every one of us, lined us up on the first base line. They gave us the big 10-gallon hats, beautiful though. I mean, these were official hats of Texas. And also they gave Ted a pair of cowboy boots that they fashioned some baseball spikes out of. They put the baseball spikes on the bottom of the cowboy boots. There's a picture floating around somewhere where he's holding them up. You can see it, but I'll never forget that, you know.
That's great.
Yeah. And I lived in Euless, Texas, which was right next to Arlington. And it was a small town back then. I mean, the town was so small that the entering and exiting Euless was the same sign, you know. So it was,
and you increased the population by you doubled the population when you moved in, right?
Exactly. But meanwhile, I guess that town now, Euless, is a thriving metropolis, you know.
Yeah.
Let me ask you.
Well, that's it. I mean, Bob Short he's an interesting character in all of this, and especially, in pushing the game into the Sun Belt. You know, if we look at, to maybe get us a little back on track to what Ian, I think, is hoping we'll talk about a little bit more is 72 and what's changing, and certainly, baseball moving west and out into the Sun Belt is a big part of what's happening and how the game is changing and how and where the revenue is. Certainly, especially for a cash-strapped owner like Bob Short, right? Wasn't he, Jimmy? Wasn't he infamously in debt? Usually, like really over-leveraged in terms of what he owed on the team.
Exactly, and he was wealthy to begin with, and most owners are, especially these days. But back then, owners relied on attendance and hot dog sales and the rest of that stuff that they had their bottom line fashioned after. In Washington, they were drawing flies there. They never drew well, and so Bob Short, he saw this whole Texas thing unfolding, and they basically said, "Come on down. We'll give you a blank check if you move the club down here," and the rest is history.
And let me say something. Good.
Well, I was just I was trying to remember, what kind of stadium did they have for you when you guys moved down there? Jimmy, where did you play originally? Was that the Arlington? Was it Arlington Stadium? What was the name of that park?
Arlington Stadium, but it was a brand new park. Brand spanking.
And that was baseball only, right? That wasn't baseball and football.
No, baseball only. And
the Cowboys were playing in Texas Stadium.
Exactly. Yeah. No, this was baseball only, and it was, as I said, a brand new ballpark. I haven't seen the new one, but it's one step beyond the one they had originally, and the original one was a beautiful yard.
And at the time, what was going on, in 72, like Krister said, we were expanding west. Again, Seattle will get a team in a few more years. Oakland was probably the powerhouse at the time, winning 5 championships in a row. But what happened was to the amazement of Marvin Miller and the owners, like Jimmy said, the solidarity of the players was like strong as stainless steel. The union voted to strike barely a week before opening day. Everyone went home, and the tally wasn't even close. 47 of the 48 player reps said yes to the walkout. And in response, the owners felt that smashing the players' resolve was a higher priority than playing baseball until they started losing revenue.
Right.
So I want to talk about that, Krister.
So, and that, of course, is like the classic thing, right? And we're talking about Bob Short a little bit. This collection of owners is quite an interesting group, and especially the smaller market guys. They're the ones, that the revenue was hurting the most, usually. The bigger market clubs tended to have bigger reserves, and they had more sort of ready cash. But for the smaller market clubs, once they got, 3-4 weeks into the strike, the loss of revenue, they were having a hard time keeping the doors open. As Jimmy pointed out, there still were a lot of clubs that were in that old model of we make our money on, we sell tickets and we sell concessions. And that's how we make our money. Again, the TV piece was starting to get to be a bigger deal, but they didn't really understand how to work that yet. So that was always a huge problem in owner solidarity. Player solidarity was not hard for the players to achieve, but owner solidarity, when you have all these different personality types and all of these different financial situations, it didn't take long for a lot of financial pressure on the especially on the smaller market owners. I think the Griffiths, especially up in Minnesota, they were in noticeably in tough shape. Plus, he couldn't keep his mouth shut, right? He was constantly complaining about how tight his bottom line was and everything else. And so, that creates that dynamic that also leads to player success, because by holding out and actually following through on holding out, they called the owners bluff. And the owners weren't able to keep their solidarity together, and the owners started to realize they all needed each other. They had to, the guys like Gussie Busch, who had deeper reserves and all that brewery money, couldn't play ball without the other owners that maybe weren't quite as financially solvent in the game. And so they realized they were more interdependent than maybe they'd originally thought. And that, kind of created this situation where the players were able to be victorious. But certainly their solidarity, that's the key thing. They were sticking together and they weren't going to crack. And that was a real wake-up call for the owners, who for decades had treated the players in a real paternalistic way. As Jimmy said several times, they treated them like their property. because they basically owned the rights to their services, so they could treat them like their property. And had taken advantage of that for a long time. And so it was a real bucket of cold water to the owners to realize that this was no longer going to be the dynamic of their relationship.
Exactly. And you hit the nail right on the head by that phrase. By that phrase, you said that we called their bluff. We called their bluff, and they had no retort. And they started losing money, and that's the death knell for most people. You know, when they start losing money, they start rethinking what they're thinking, you know.
Now, and immediately guys had more leverage then too, because they were more, the teams were owned more like by families. They were family-owned businesses, and today they're so corporate where they could probably withstand like a strike like they did before because they have so much money behind them as far as corporate dollars go. But I think you guys hit it at the right time, and then once you started winning, you never stopped losing because Miller knew how to press every button.
Every button he knew, yeah. I was going to go to the Hall of Fame this summer, but I'm not going now because Marvin's not there.
I have a T-shirt that says "Put Marvin Miller in the Hall of Fame," and I wear it when I go there.
I'm going on strike.
But let me ask you this, and for both Jimmy and Krister, I know you wrote in the book, Krister, the 72 strike had two repercussions. Number one, the average American felt that the big leaders had abused their privilege, craving for a bigger piece of the pie when it was perceived they already had enough to eat. And two, the 72 shortened season, it really did prove to be a hard luck for the Detroit Tigers, and the Red Sox, because they didn't play an even amount of games.
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely had an impact on the way that all of that, the competitive impact was big, just like it was in 81, right? Not being able to play that balanced 162 game season, and those of us,
right.
Well, all of us remember when it truly was a balanced schedule. Right? Like, they don't mess around with it anymore. It's not truly balanced anymore, is it? But I remember as a kid in the 70s, you played 12 games out of division and you played 18 games in division. Right? Does that sound right, guys? And
right.
To create a situation like you're saying, Ian, where teams weren't playing the same number of games, they missed out on opportunities to improve their standing and get into the postseason. Yeah, absolutely. In 72 and then again in 81. And talk about where Montreal got the shaft, right? Shouldn't they have been was it Montreal? Yeah. Who wound up in a one-game playoff with the Dodgers? Or was that the NLCS that year?
Oh,
I'm trying to remember.
You're thinking in 81 where the Cincinnati Reds and the Baltimore Orioles had the best combined record in their leagues and neither one made the playoffs.
Right. The Dodgers should not have won the division over the Reds. That's what it was.
Totally, but I can overlook that as a Dodger fan.
Well, me too. There's no asterisk next to that 81 World Championship.
Heck no.
Yeah. Great show today, guys. Great show. I mean, this is much more than I expected, and everybody's making a wonderful contribution.
Well, you know what? You know what we're going to do? Because we're not going to be able to get past 72 here. We're not going to be able to get past 72, so we're going to have a part 2 to this, a part 3 to the whole series so far. Would you both like to come back and we'll talk about 72 to 76 in another month or so?
Sure.
Oh, sure. Be glad to.
Yeah, well, because this was really an important show. Mark, with all three, you know what? You guys could just throw me out as the chairperson and just take over the show with your brand of celebrity status and your personalities. They eclipse mine. They eclipse mine.
Like John, we went to defer.
Yeah,
it sounds like there isn't a microphone we didn't like,
This was a great show. I hope both of you guys enjoyed it. We'll get you back on the show. Mark, you did great. I'm glad you were able to make this time because I know how much you appreciate Marvin Miller and how important is this show going to be when people learn the truth, like Jimmy said? And, you said that the gospel of Jimmy Driscoll, he has his own gospel. We'll talk about that on another time. Anyhow, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. I hope you had a great show. Guys, hold the line. Marvin Miller, can't say enough about him. Should be in the Hall of Fame. 72 strike, everything leading up to it. Very important. Go out and buy Krister's book, Baseball's Power Shift. Go call Jimmy Driscoll. He'll tell you about what's going on in baseball at that time. We'll be back on Genesis. They'll be back on Genesis next time. I'm Ian Kahanowitz, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.